we present the tragedy of young MacIntyre by Cyril Hare. "My boy," MacIntyre's rich uncle is reputed to have said to him, "if you go to the bar, you will make a name for yourself." There were sound reasons for the old gentleman's optimism, for MacIntyre had many advantages. He had good looks, a pleasant manner, and, above all, an unusual capacity for assimilating everything he learned. It was this last quality which, oddly enough, led to his failure in the profession. Although, still more oddly, it helped him make a name for himself more famous than that of the most optimistic uncles could expect. For it cannot be denied that in a remarkably short space of time, young MacIntyre's name became famous in the courts and to the public outside them. It is indeed written large over many pages of many reports in several successive years. The only objection from his point of view was that it was written in the wrong place. It is the ambition of every young barrister to feature in the law reports, and MacIntyre was no exception, but he had always seen himself in the role of MacIntyre for the plaintiffs, or even, in higher flights of fancy, Mr. Justice MacIntyre agreed. It was not to be. For him was reserved a fame of a different sort, less glorious, but perhaps more lasting. The fame that attaches to the names of John Doe and Richard Roe. Lawyers will understand what I mean when I explain that the unfortunate subject of this tale was the hero of those famous actions, MacIntyre versus Speckles, and Speckles versus MacIntyre, which in their turn produced the scarcely less celebrated cases of Fandango versus the Agglomerated Press Limited, and in Re Beckworth, Simpleton, and others. Their legal aspects have been fully treated in the monumental 54th edition of Blogs on Tort, and I can only refer my readers to those pages for consideration of the important problems involved. My purpose is to unfold something of the human interest which underlay them, and which at the time convulsed the whole nation, monopolized the picture papers, and nearly caused a general election. MacIntyre was duly called to the bar, and duly had his first case. It was a defence at the Old Bailey, and his kindest friends could not have called it a very successful performance, for the jury did not even go through the formality of leaving the box before returning a verdict of guilty, and a sentence of 3 years' penal servitude. Nonetheless, this was a quite inadequate reason for the deep depression into which he sank as a result of the trial. It was in vain that his friends pointed out to him that his client, a larcenous gentleman of some celebrity, was much too well known even to have had a chance of being acquitted, and that his ill-considered action of picking the foreman's pocket while on bail and waiting for the case to come on had ruined all prospects of appealing to the sympathies of the jury, and finally that the letting loose of such an unpleasant specimen would have been a serious blow to the brighter London movement. MacIntyre refused to be comforted. "If they had only listened to me, I shouldn't have minded so much." "Of course they didn't listen to you, old boy. It was nearly 1 o'clock. They wanted their lunch." "Still, out of mere decency, they might have... No. I know what it was. My manner didn't appeal to them. You know, my stance was all wrong. I didn't keep my eye on the ball, and I forgot to follow through at the end of my sentences. And I don't think my voice carried either. There was a man at the back who had his hand to his ear the whole time." "Oh, you needn't worry about him. He was stone deaf. I heard him explaining afterwards he thought we were trying a bigamist." "Well, anyhow, it's not good enough. What's the good of being a barrister if you can't make the jury hear you?" "You ought to take lessons," said someone, all unconscious of the fearful consequence that his words were to have. "I've a jolly good mind to, because if I can't do better than this, I should have to give up. I shouldn't have minded so much, if only—" But by this time his friends had followed the example of the jury and gone to lunch. The idea, though, once formed, that he was in need of training in the art of elocution, rankled for the rest of the day in MacIntyre's mind. It was still there when evening came, and he gloomily made his way home on the top of an omnibus. Fate, in the shape of a prolonged traffic block, intervened. The block occurred in the Strand, just opposite one of those nondescript buildings which are always on the verge of demolition in the sacred cause of street widening. He noted idly that on the ground floor a hopeful jeweller was, for the second year running, announcing stupendous reductions in all his stock, because in another few days he would have to close forever. Then, raising his eyes to the first-floor level, he became aware of two dingy windows, on which faded gold lettering announced, T. Speckles, expert elocutionist. In a moment MacIntyre, with grim determination in his eye, had leapt from the bus, and before the traffic block had resolved itself, he was in T. Speckles' consulting room. Mr. Speckles seemed glad to see MacIntyre. Indeed, he was quite effusive in his welcome. From his appearance and his surroundings, MacIntyre judged that the aspirants to the art of elocution were few, for neither indicated much prosperity. He was a small, dark-haired, sallow man, with a mournful black moustache and a black frock coat which had certainly known better days, and probably a better owner. Altogether his looks did not inspire much confidence, but when he spoke, it was at once obvious that he did not take the name of elocutionist in vain. His voice was something between a bark and a boom. The vowels were prolonged to twice their usual length, and every consonant made itself felt with a distinctness that was little short of appalling. The unprejudiced would not have called the result beautiful, but it was music to MacIntyre's ears. Here, he felt, was the fellow who could really deliver the goods. And when Mr. Speckles, in ear-piercing tones, assured him that he would be happy to accommodate him on the most generous terms for a full course of 12 lessons, which could begin the very next morning, MacIntyre felt that the road to fortune was open before him. Next day saw MacIntyre in Mr. Speckles' office once more, eager to begin. But before the lesson commenced, his teacher insisted on 2 things. One was payment in advance for half the course. That was perhaps only to be expected, and MacIntyre submitted without a murmur. The other was more unusual. From the depths of a musty cupboard, Mr. Speckles produced an aged dictaphone, and invited MacIntyre to make use of it. He said it would make an interesting comparison afterwards. MacIntyre asked diffidently what he should say. Speckles suggested that he imagined he was addressing a jury. He switched on the machine and signed to his pupil to speak. Members of a jury, I rise to address you on behalf of the unfortunate Mr. Speckles. Really, you know, members of a jury, he's not such a blight... Oh, no, he is not. Things may look pretty black against him at present, but really, you know, taking everything into consideration and so forth, so to speak, I shouldn't wonder if you didn't find he was more sinned against than sinning. Really, you know, it is the Englishman's privilege to be found guilty until he is innocent. The other way around, if you follow me. And this poor man Speckles, that is, of course, if you can find it in your hearts to say he is a man.
I think that will do. You have much to learn. I will have a gramophone record made of that for you. It may entertain you when you have progressed somewhat. Now we will begin lesson 1. Exercises of the vocal cords.
They began. They exercised the vocal cords, and on the next day the labial muscles. During succeeding weeks together they trod the difficult path of voice production, expression, breath control with muscular exercises, and the mastery of the epiglottis, and indeed all the other mysteries of Mr. Speckles' craft. And MacIntyre, who was, as I have said, a diligent young man, continued his exercises at home. He practised them in his bath. He practised them when he got up in the morning, and then again when he went to bed at night. No matron in the 40s, determined to recover that schoolgirl figure, exercised half so hard as he did. For nearly a month his friends saw nothing of him, and as he lived alone with only a deaf old housekeeper for company, nobody knew anything of the tremendous effects of Mr. Speckles' teaching. None, that is, except Mr. Speckles himself. His pride in MacIntyre's progress was immense. He frequently declared that he was the best pupil he had ever had. Once, indeed, towards the end of the course, he even went so far as to say that he, Speckles, could not have done so well. It's a curious fact, but very few people are conscious of the sound of their own voices, which is not to say that they do not like the sound of their own voices, but that's another matter. They can tell you that so-and-so's voice is hard or soft, and that someone else speaks through his nose, but they have not the smallest idea of what their own voice is like. So it was in complete innocence that young MacIntyre returned to his chambers when the course was completed. He knew, of course, that his voice had gained in resonance, and his manner in assurance, as the result of Mr. Speckles' ministrations. The occasion when every passenger on the top of a bus passing down the Strand looked up to the sky expecting a thunderstorm when he formulated in Mr. Speckles' room was still a precious memory. But how much he had changed he did not realize. He was not left long in doubt. At his first tremendous bark of greeting, his clerk, a bald and blameless old man, leapt bodily a foot from his seat before collapsing in a faint to the floor. 2 panes of glass were shivered, and a pigeon dropped dead in the Temple Gardens. When he called a cheery good morning to his friend Goodbody, who shared his room, the learned K.C., who lived on the floor below, sent up to complain that the plaster of his ceiling was cracking. Shouting at the top of his voice to make himself heard, Goodbody besought him to moderate his tones.
"I'm sorry, old man,"
said MacIntyre, in what seemed to him little more than a whisper, but still in a tone which bored through his hearer's ears like an auger.
"I didn't mean to talk so loud, but I've been studying elocution. I told you I'd learn to deliver the goods, and by Jove, I shall make myself heard now. Can't I?"
"You certainly can. Heaven help any jury you get in front of now. But for goodness sake, drop it a bit and talk normally for a change."
"Confound you!"
replied MacIntyre with a stridency that would have turned Mr. Speckles green with envy.
"I am talking normally. What on earth are you driving at?"
Goodbody's face took on an expression of horror. "Heaven and earth! Do you really mean it's stuck like that? For good?" "Our nurses told us that if we made ugly faces like that, and the wind changed, we would stay like it for always. What the wind had been doing while MacIntyre was in Mr. Speckles' office I do not know, but there was no question that his voice was changed, and changed permanently. Gone were the gentle tones, the soft and hesitating utterances with which nature had endowed him. Mr. Speckles had set his stamp upon him, and it was not to be effaced. He could talk now with the utmost fluency on any subject under the sun. He could talk with perfect clarity and distinctness, giving its due value every consonant, and leaving his hearer in no possible doubt about the vowels. He could make himself heard first time in a public telephone call-office. He could do anything, in fact, except talk like a normal human being. It took some time for the truth of the change that had taken place in him to sink in. In spite of the asseverations of Goodbody, of his clerk, who gave notice immediately afterwards, and of everybody else whom he consulted, for a long time MacIntyre persisted that he was all right, a little improved and strengthened in voice production, but no more. At last he remembered Mr. Speckles' gramophone record.
"We'll try it out, and if there's been any change worth talking about, I'll—"
Happily he did not promise to do anything particularly rash, for scarcely had the needle of Goodbody's gramophone touched the disc before the horrid truth dawned upon him. It was a dreadful moment. Dean Swift, in his old age, reading one of the works of his youth, was heard to murmur sadly, "What a genius I had! when I wrote that book." But even his sorrow cannot have equalled MacIntyre's as he listened to the dulcet voice that once was his and never could be again. As the gentle wavering tones smote his ear, his eyes filled with tears. "Well," said Goodbody, when the record came to an end, "do I win?"
"Win?"
roared MacIntyre with a bellow like a ship's siren.
"That swine Speckles! More sinned against than sinning, indeed! Let me only get hold of a blighter who's done this!"
He snatched up the record and was about to fling it out of the window when Goodbody seized it from him.
"Don't smash it! You'll want it. Why?"
"Because it's evidence, of course." What evidence? Why the... Do you mean that you are not going to sue this fellow for the damage he's done to your voice? You're not going to take it lying down, surely? Get hold of your solicitor and go for him." MacIntyre considered for a moment. "By gum," he thought at last, "I will."
"By gum, I will!"
he said. Such was the origin of the famous action of MacIntyre's v. Speckles. Speckles v. MacIntyre, of course, was Mr. Speckles' action for the balance of his fees for the lessons. The two were eventually consolidated, but not until, after the best legal fashion, some thousands of pounds had been wasted in trying to try them separately. It was fully reported at the time, and I need not trouble with the legal details of it, but it took about 2 years to decide whether or not MacIntyre had any claim for damages at all. His counsel enjoyed themselves immensely over it. They claimed for trespass, for contract, for tort, and breach of copyright. Speckles' men gave as good as they got, and said it was neither one thing nor the other. Eventually, after the case had been twice up to the House of Lords and down again on preliminaries, the case came for hearing before Mr. Justice Snorbury and a special jury. MacIntyre had briefed Sir Eliphas Snarler, K.C., and Mr. Speckles had selected Mr. Snorter, K.C., whose ceiling MacIntyre had brought down, and who had hated him ever since. The court was crowded when Sir Eliphas rose to open the case for the plaintiff. The crowd overflowed from the public galleries into the Strand, and the mounted police had twice to charge to keep order. Sir Eliphas was at the top of his form, which, considering he had 1,000 guineas on his brief and a refresher of 100 a day, was not perhaps surprising. The conclusion of his speech was masterly.
"Members of the jury, before my unhappy client fell a victim to the blandishments of Mr. Speckles, he was blessed with a diffident, unassuming manner and a soft and charming voice. Those priceless attributes he has lost, and lost forever. His manner is now blatant and assertive, his voice coarse and unattractive in the extreme. And this, members of the jury, I am in a position to prove. Before my client goes into the witness box to demonstrate by every word and gesture the pernicious effects of Mr. Speckles' training, I shall place before you unimpeachable evidence of what he was before the unhappy occurrences I have described. I have here a gramophone record, which will be played to you by the instrument now on the table before me. And when you have heard it, and compared it with the lamentable noises now produced by my client, you will, in my submission, will have no hesitation in finding a verdict in his favour, and that for the most substantial, nay, exemplary damages."
Mr. Snorter was on his feet immediately, objecting that the gramophone record could not be received in evidence. He had been speaking for over 3/4 of an hour when it was observed that the judge was asleep, and the court adjourned for the day. The discussion as to the advisability of gramophone records lasted 3 days and cost the parties something over £1,000 apiece. Perhaps I should explain at this point that the impecunious Mr. Speckles was supported in his action by the Amalgamated Society of Elocutionists and Voice Production Professors, and that MacIntyre's wealthy uncle was blessed with a sense of humour. Finally, the record was admitted in evidence, and a hushed court heard the soft tones that had been MacIntyre's lisping the defence of the man who was about to ruin them. By the time the trial was nearly over, some highly profitable weeks for Sir Eliphaz and Mr. Snorter having elapsed, MacIntyre felt fairly confident of the result. The judge had listened to his evidence with attention. He had been deaf for 10 years. MacIntyre was the first voice he'd heard in all that time. And there were 4 women on the jury whom he was sure he had impressed. But it was these women who were to prove his undoing. They and the gramophone, which Sir Eliphaz had fought for so strenuously. For when Mr. Justice Snorbury's long, learned, and painfully boring summing up at last came to an end with "Kindly consider your verdict," the youngest and prettiest of the jurywomen leaned forward, smiled sweetly, and said, "My lord, may the jury take the gramophone and record with them to help in considering the verdict?" In spite of his age, the judge was still susceptible to feminine charms. He was dimly conscious that a good-looking young woman was asking him something, and having disposed of a long and tiresome case, he was feeling in a state of sleepy amiability. "Yes, decidedly. Anything you wish, my dear young lady." And the gramophone was picked up and carried out in triumph by the foreman of the jury. The case had come to an end at 4:45, and those experienced in the ways of juries have been heard to say that at that time of day they are never very long. Human nature being what it is, they say, the claims of justice never very long resist the attractions of the train home to tea. But on this occasion the cynics were confuted. Half an hour went by. Still the jury came not out. The crowd in court began to melt away. MacIntyre and Mr. Speckles, at opposite ends of the same bench, having passed through all stages from excitement to utter boredom, were duly staring in front of themselves, long past caring what happened. Sir Eliphaz and Mr. Snorter had departed, leaving their unfortunate juniors to see the end of it, and as for the judge, the only happy man in court, he was sound asleep. At last, after the jury had been gone an hour and a half, something, perhaps the pangs of hunger, woke him. He yawned, stretched, and looked incredulously at the clock. "Good gracious! This jury is deliberating for an exceedingly long time. Usher, be good enough to inquire whether they are desirous of any further direction on points of law or fact, and if so, I shall be glad to assist them." The usher departed on his errand, and the court sank back into slumber. He was gone some time. When he reappeared, he was pale and shaken, as much as any so dignified a person could ever be. "Well, does the jury require assistance?" Speechless, the usher shook his head. "If they cannot agree upon a verdict, they must be discharged. Do they say they cannot agree?" Again the usher shook his head. "Then what in the name of Blackstone are they doing?" "May it please you, my lord, they're dancing." His lordship could not believe his ears. Considering their quality, there was no reason why he should. "They are what? Speak up, man, I can't hear you." "The dancing, my lord." "I cannot hear a word you say. Mr. MacIntyre, I always understand you. What is this fellow here trying to tell me?" "My lord, he says the jury are dancing." "Dancing? Dancing? That's most improper. That's unheard of behaviour. I've never known anyone dance in the courts of justice since I was called to the bar. There must be some mistake about it. Usher, are you quite positive you heard the sound of dancing? Dancing proceeding from the jury room?" "I'm quite positive, my lord. And what's more, I saw them ladies this morning when they went into the box with what looked like gramophone records under their coats. It's a put-up job, my lord, that's the truth." The truth was even worse than the gloomy usher imagined. For how could he tell, how could the judge tell, how could anyone have told that the jury box had all this time been harbouring an angel unawares, in the far corner seat of a back row to be precise, and that angel was no other than the celebrated Mexican, Fandango. It was true, though, for weeks now, by enforcing him to sit upon the jury, the royal courts of justice had been effectively imprisoning in their gloomy walls the most famous ballroom dancer of the age. Fandango, the favourite teacher of half the crown heads of Europe, the man who could make the fortune of any nightclub by merely promising to look in for 10 minutes during the evening. Fandango, the exquisite, the olive-skinned, was on the jury, and pretty little Miss Beckwith, who sat next to him, was determined to make the most of it. So was plump, fair-haired Mrs. Simpleton, when the great man had been induced to admit his identity one day at lunch. That thrilling but terribly difficult new dance, the Baltimore Squirm, had just been introduced, and the chance of a free lesson from the one man in all England who could dance it properly was not to be missed. It's not for me to say, because I do not know, by what means Miss Beckwith induced Fandango, who was notoriously averse to doing something for nothing, to lower himself so far as to give an exhibition of his art before an audience of 11. One can only conclude that several weeks of the atmosphere of the courts had somewhat weakened his powers of resistance, and after all, nobody can sit in such close proximity to a really charming girl, as Miss Beckwith was, without being affected in some degree. However it came about, there they were, at 5:30, turning the jury-room into as good an imitation of a Café de Paris as its limited accommodation allowed. Meanwhile consternation reigned in court. Mr. Justice Snorbury was not a particularly quick thinker, and for the first time in his professional life he found himself confronted with something entirely without precedent. But two things experience taught him. "Most improper, most improper," could be repeated again and again. I really do not know what to do about this. Upon my soul, I don't. And the second, "I shall consult my learned brethren about this. Meanwhile, they can stay where they are. The court is adjourned." And forthwith he left the bench, only to find that his learned brethren had long since gone home, and there was nobody left in the building to whom he could turn to for guidance. "Most improper." He took off his wig and gown in his room, and said again, "Most improper," and put on his silk hat. His car was waiting patiently at the judge's entrance. Tired with his long day's work, he climbed wearily in. Never mind." He sank back and went to sleep. The wicked behaviour of the jury, the opinion of his learned brethren, were all forgotten by him now, for it was Friday evening, and the courts of justice do not sit on Saturdays. It was the Sunday papers that started the agitation about the imprisoned jurors, but as Mr. Justice Snorbury never read the Sunday papers, they did not worry him. The fact that his absent-mindedness had spread dismay into 12 blameless homes left him quite calm and unruffled. The existence of the dancing 12 had completely passed out of his mind, and unfortunately he was the only person who had the power to release them. When on Monday morning he took his seat, and somebody timidly ventured to remind him of their existence, he was as nearly startled as his great age and serenity ever allowed him to be. "The jury? Well, of course, bring them in." They were brought, or rather carried in. 60 hours of incarceration, even with a gramophone, and the world's best dancer for company, is a trifle trying. Pale, dishevelled, and miserable, they were propped up before the bench. "Let me see. Have you agreed upon your verdict?" It was the last straw. All 4 women fainted, and Fandango uttered remarks that were happily unintelligible. "Apparently you haven't. Oh, yes, I remember now. You were the people who spent your time dancing. Oh, disgraceful. I've a good mind to commit you all for contempt of court. However, you can go now, and let us proceed with the next case." And with that the learned judge dismissed the jury from the court, and the whole affair from his mind. The great British public, however, and its mouthpiece, the great British press, did not treat the affair so easily. On the contrary, they took it to their hearts with gusto. Miss Beckwith, who had an uncle who was an OBE, and Mrs. Simpleton, who was related to the Lord Mayor, so they were not people to be trifled with, vented their grievances, and soon all England rang with them. They talked of Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, habeas corpus, and a variety of other things which they did not understand. It so happened there was a lack of sensational murders and fashionable weddings at the time, and the newspaper world was overjoyed at the opportunity.
"Should jurors dance?"
became the question of the hour, and the country was rent in twain between those who answered,
"Yes, I should,"
and demanded poor Snawberry's blood, and the killjoys who said,
"No,"
and were base enough to suggest that it served them all right. But on the whole, there could be no doubt that the eyes had it, and the 12 jurors became popular heroes. Their photographs were in every picture paper. The unmarried among them received a total of no less than 214 proposals of marriage, of which Miss Beckworth accounted for 185. Their views were invited by the Sunday newspapers on every subject under the sun, from shingling to birth control, and the Baltimore Squirm was in their honour renamed the Jury Room Jeebies. Meanwhile, every effort was made to secure redress for the wrongs they had suffered. Earnest MPs asked questions in Parliament. Ministers were heckled in their constituencies. Actions were launched and struck out and reconstructed and adjourned. And in the end, I really believe that the government would have fallen if they had not dealt with the matter boldly by passing a special Act of Parliament, presenting the jurors with £100 apiece for their trouble, and promoting Mr. Justice Snawberry to the Court of Appeal, where there would be no jurors to worry him. But the matter did not end there. As I have said, there were killjoys who did not sympathise with the woes of the jurors. Among them was the editor of the Megaphone, which was owned by the Amalgamated Press, which is owned by Lord Baronscourt. It may, or it may not, be coincidence that that great journal was at the time conducting a campaign entitled "Keep the Alien Out of England," and that his lordship was largely interested in promoting the revival of Morris dancing on village greens. But the fact remains that it was bitterly hostile to the 12 all through their campaign, and after it was all over, rated them soundly in one of its most pompous leading articles, entitled "Aliens and the Law," and the material parts, as they were afterwards described by learned counsel, were as follows. "The disgraceful series of events which has recently been terminated by the intervention of the government reveals a disquieting, not to say ominous, state of affairs. It's clear that the orgies by which British justice has been brought into contempt would never have occurred but for the presence upon the jury of a half-caste Mexican dancer, to whose incitements the remainder of his colleagues succumbed. We have had occasion in the past to warn our readers of the presence of alien influence in the army, the church, the post office, the British Museum, and the Commissioners of Woods and Forests. But this is the first time, we believe, that an alien hand has been permitted to pollute the fount of justice." The result of this effusion, as will be remembered, was the case of Fandango versus the Amalgamated Press, in which Fandango successfully proved that his name was William Griggs and he was born in Peckham. His counsel, need I say that it was Sir Eliphaz? It was Sir Eliphaz, pointed out with irresistible logic to the jury that not only was it a horrid libel on an Englishman to call him an alien, but also that his client would suffer untold damages by being compelled to reveal that he was not Mexican at all. "What attraction is there in dancing with a Mr. Griggs? What restaurant or cabaret will engage a mere Englishman for such work? His livelihood is gone, and you must replace it." Profoundly moved, an English jury assessed the damages at £10,000, a sum which Lord Baronscourt could well afford. And since, oddly enough, Fandango's popularity was not destroyed, as Sir Eliphaz had feared, but rather improved by the advertisement, he may be taken to have done well out of the affair. As for Mr. Speckles, although he never attempted to have his action retried, and although the balance of MacIntyre's fees are still due and owing, he is not to be pitied. Immediately after the action, he was elected perpetual president of the Amalgamated Society of Elocutionists, and his name became known wherever the science of elocution is practised. He has offices now in the smart new building which has replaced the old one in the Strand, and when I last heard of him, he was on his way to deliver a series of lectures in America. And MacIntyre, the innocent cause of all the trouble, what of him? I have called this truthful little history a tragedy, and so from the legal point of view it was, for the Temple lost a promising advocate and a charming fellow. But the ill wind that blew him out of the law blew him good after all, for it blew him to Hollywood, the one place in the world where expression counts for a great deal and voice production for nothing. He has, it appears, an ideal photographic face, and the only thing now that can prevent him making a fortune would be the universal introduction of talking films. P.S. I saw Sir Eliphaz going down Piccadilly yesterday in a new Rolls-Royce, so it seems he's all right. You have been listening to The Tragedy of Young MacIntyre by Cyril Hare. It was read by Matthew Jones. Do listen to some of the other stories on our channel, and why not try our other channel, full of exclusive, chucklesome tales. Details in the description box below. If you like Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, and others, you might consider joining the MJAM Story Club. The link is also in the description box. Thank you for listening.